Good evening, everyone. My name is Katherine Besser, and I am your moderator for this rainy evening. Tonight is our inaugural Civic Action Conversation brought to you by RVA Engage. Just a quick bit about RVA Engage. They are a collaboration of community engagement professionals in the nonprofit, corporate, government, and educational sectors. They seek to inform and catalyze community members to engage in the issues that most impact our region. The 2022 Civic Action Conversation series will focus on critical regional priorities and possible action steps for engagement. The topics of this series are chosen because they reflect some of the highest priorities we see in our community. The series will seek to present multiple perspectives on each topic. We invite you to listen, learn, and take action in a way that works best for you. Our topic for this evening, early childhood education, why it matters and what you can do. While I finish doing a few opening comments, we invite you now to take a second and share your favorite childhood book in our chat. A few things about tonight's evening. The Civic Action Conversation series is brought to you by the following community collaborators: the Bonner Center of Civic Engagement at the University of Richmond, Chamber RVA, the Community Foundation for Greater Richmond, Plan RVA, VCU's Center for Community Engagement and Impact, and VPM, what you all know as the home of NPR and PBS. I have a very special thank you to tonight's event managers. From VPM, Mary Arrett, who's the Community Engagement Manager. From the Community Foundation, Gail Cavallero, who is the Civic Engagement Manager. And also from the Community Foundation, Christina Mastriano, who's the VP of Civic Engagement. So just a quick set of housekeeping things to get us started. We're asking everyone to enter any questions you have into the Q&A. And after each speaker, we will pull a few select questions and engage them. Resources during the course of the meeting for each speaker will be posted in the chat. We are recording tonight's event, and we will post it and the resources on rvaengage.org as soon as the recording is available. We will also send all registered attendees an email to alert you when it is available. And last but not least, throughout the evening, we will have a series of polling questions. Hopefully they will help to educate you more about tonight's topic. They're all anonymous, so please feel free to participate. So just a quick introduction of me. I'm a retired corporate executive who has also become an advocate for early childhood. I've served on lots of boards for numerous nonprofit organizations who have all had a strong focus on early childhood, including one that is near and dear to me, which is Smart Beginnings of Greater Richmond. Smart Beginnings is the regional backbone for a broad coalition of organizations that are working together to improve the entire system of early care and education. We all know that children don't choose the circumstance into which they are born. Smart Beginnings works to ensure that all children in our region, birth through 5, will be healthy, well cared for, and ready to succeed in school. It's simple for me. I want the best for my children, and therefore I want the best for all children. They all grow up in the world together. Every child needs high quality early childhood experiences, regardless of their family circumstances. It puts them all on the same path to prosperity. What happens from birth through 5 not only gets you ready for kindergarten, it sets the path for life. Tonight's program seeks to help frame this issue and share some of the important financial, economic, and social aspects of the value of investing in a strong early childhood system, both for early care and education. So let's get started. Our first polls are on the screen. If you'll just take a couple of minutes to answer 2 quick questions, tell us a little bit about who you are, and what group you represent in tonight's conversation. And then the second question will be a question about what is early childhood? When we say that, what is the definition and what are the ages of children that we're discussing? So please join by participating right now. There are actually 2 correct answers. 0 to 5 is what we typically focus on, where the milestone is kindergarten readiness and the test for kindergarten readiness, but many are extending it to 0 to 8 as well. And the milestone there is the assessment of third grade reading and math skills. So both answers are right, and you don't get to 5 or 8 without getting to 3 first. So everybody who picked that answer gets credit as well. So let's move on, and I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Just a reminder, you can post questions in the Q&A, and after the presentation, we'll take a few of those, and resources will also be posted in the chat. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Elliot Haspel. He is a nationally recognized early childhood policy expert. He's the author of Crawling Behind: America's Childcare Crisis and How to Fix It. His writings have been featured in top publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. Elliot serves as the program officer for education, policy, and research at the Robbins Foundation. He holds a master's in education policy from Harvard's Graduate School of Education and a Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of Virginia. He lives in Richmond's North Side neighborhood with his wife and 2 young daughters. Elliot, take us away.
Hi, thank you, Katherine, and thank you all. So I'm excited to set the scene here today. So I think I've got some slides which will be pulled up here in a second. But I'm going to talk about broadly, why do we care about early childhood education? What is the current state of the field, and what are some things that at the local and state level we can think about doing to address some of those issues? So, and then they'll have a great panel coming forward who are going to go into deeper dives on many of those issues. So early childhood education there are multiple reasons why we care about it, and it's because there are multiple sort of audiences or stakeholders for it, right? There's the child, there's the parent or the family, and then there's broader society and the broader economy. And so on the child side of things, let's start there. There's sort of the end user of this. And what we know is that an explosive amount of brain growth happens within the first 5 years, really the first 8 years, but the first 5 years of life. And a lot of that brain growth is really mediated by early childhood experiences. And that's every early childhood experience. That's the experiences with parents, it's experiences with relatives, and that's certainly experience with outside caregivers. And in America, and including in Richmond, we have 2/3 or more of all young children have all of their available parents in the workforce or guardians in the workforce. And what that means is that 2 out of 3 kids or more are in some kind of regular non-parental care arrangement. And so because we know how much of the brain architecture develops much like a house, right? You're building the foundation and up, it's cumulative. So those neural connections that are being made in the early years, those neural connections that are being made through those early experiences are laying the foundation for academic learning. They're laying the foundation for socio-emotional learning. They're laying the foundation for everything that child is going to become. And so we really know from a child perspective, having access to high quality early experiences is really critical. It's also really critical for parents because obviously, or childcare, just like public schools, allows parents to work. And so we know that, when we've seen that every place basically in America and abroad that has ever instituted sort of broadly accessible and affordable early childhood education, early care and education, has seen an almost immediate spike in labor force participation of parents. And primarily that obviously falls on women and on mothers. And so there's a report prior to the pandemic showing that about 2 million women in America either have not taken a job, have turned down a promotion, or are working fewer hours than they otherwise would have purely because of childcare issues. So we know this is a major issue for families, and we know that one of the other things that kids know, because all of these factors interrelate, one of the things that kids need to thrive is stable, sort of relatively content parents. And when you're stressed out because you have to make ends meet, you're stressed out because you are having an issue with childcare, then that can create a situation where you're in sort of a vicious cycle in terms of the child development as well. The third stakeholder for this early childhood system is the broader economy, broader society. So even if you don't have a young child, it really matters what's going on with our childcare system. That's for a couple of reasons. One is in sort of immediate the current workforce. We know productivity and absences, employee recruitment, employee retention. These are big issues that are affected by the lack of available affordable childcare. You're shrinking the available labor force pool. You're causing more turnover. All of those things are happening, which is affecting you whether or not again you have a child. And then for businesses, we know that again you're basically reducing your potential economic output by reducing the access to affordable childcare. So there are any number of figures to elucidate this, and I know some of our future speakers are going to talk about that in more detail. I will just mention that we have, again, empirical evidence about this. So we can look at Canada. So Quebec, their low-cost program has been shown to make money for that province because of how much the tax base increases when you have increased labor force participation and increased business productivity. And in Washington, D.C., when they implemented universal pre-K and almost all of the 4-year-olds in D.C., about 90% do go to that program. Within just a few years of implementing that program, they found that the labor force participation rate of the mothers of young children equalized with the labor force participation rate of the mothers of school-age children. So this isn't like a theory. We know that this works. This really does have an impact economically and on child development. Problem is, right now, America's childcare system is in crisis. And that crisis really shows up in 3 places. The first is in staffing. So obviously the pandemic came along, was a huge blow to everyone, including childcare programs. But as things have started to reopen, childcare's had a very, very difficult time getting its staff back and keeping staffing levels at a reasonable rate. And so what I mean by that is overall, the US economy is within about 1% to 2% of its pre-pandemic staffing levels at this point. The childcare industry is 12% below its pre-pandemic staffing levels, which are already pretty low. There's already a scarcity of childcare slots. And so that translates to loss of about 100,000 jobs nationally. That's a huge issue. It's a huge issue because if there's not staff, not only is that a strain on the programs, that it makes it so many programs have to close classrooms, or in some cases they have to close entirely because they can't keep those. Every childcare program has to maintain a low child to adult ratio because that's really important for quality and health and safety and all the rest of it. And so if you can't meet that ratio, you simply cannot have that classroom open. So staffing is sort of the issue with A, B, C, and D right now when you talk to folks in the childcare field. It is a real big problem, and there's really not much of a path forward, and I'll talk about this in a minute, without some sort of major public intervention. Because right now, the issue is that, as we've seen other low-wage industries start to raise their base compensation, right? You've got McDonald's and Amazon and Target. I saw someone that like gas stations now, offering like $18 an hour starting wages. Childcare programs are operating on extremely thin operating margins because again, their personnel costs are really, really, really high. And I sometimes say I was a 4th grade teacher when I started my career, and I had at one point like 32 4th graders in my class. And that was too many kids, I will say, but legally I could have that many kids under my care. In Virginia, when you're looking at max ratios of 1 to 4 for the infants and slightly more as you go into slightly older kids, that really becomes a problem for those programs. The fixed costs are so high, so they can't really raise their compensation. There's no money unless they want to charge parents more, which we don't want them to do because parents are already completely overtaxed. So staffing is an issue. We have seen costs rise. Programs have had to raise rates in some cases. And the other issue is, as I said, the supply is a major issue. We were seeing huge loss of supply, particularly among our small family childcare programs before the pandemic, and all of that has continued. So all of these trends are reflected in Richmond. I see my slides are up now. So those are just some headlines from some local news stories, and what we've got is the situation where childcare is simply not a viable business model at this point. The reason I sort of brought up that that's a recent report from the U.S. Treasury Department, and they say very clearly childcare is a failed market. It doesn't work. Basically, we're treating childcare a lot more like a restaurant or a gym than we do like a social or public good, like a library or fire department or a public school. And when you treat it like a gym or a restaurant, it's a private market good. So it means that we're asking parents, it's pay to play. In most cases, we do have a subsidy system. It is very meager. It reaches about 1 in 6 kids, families that are eligible. So you've got private market good, it's pay to play. And yet this is a foundational support for child development, for family flourishing, and for the economy. So that tension is fundamental to why we have a child care crisis. So if you go to the next couple of slides, can we advance the slides? I know who's controlling them. Yeah. So the question becomes, what can we do? We have this issue. You've obviously you may have heard that there are the Build Back Better Act. The Congress was considering would have had huge child care funding for it. That the fate of that remains undetermined. But while we're waiting to figure out what the federal government's going to do, states and localities actually still have a lot of levers to pull. And so the number one thing that we need is permanent public funding. So when I say permanent, because there was one-time funding through the American Rescue Plan Act and some other COVID response, but what can't you do with one-time funding is you can't permanently increase your compensation. You can't suddenly say we're going to offer you $18 an hour and then the money ran out 18 months later, so now we got to go back to giving you $12 an hour. So that doesn't really work. We need is a high level of funding, and so for example, in Virginia, we spend about $12,000 per kid for public education. Even for our state-funded pre-K, we're spending at $6,000-7,000. So, and that's much less for our private child care providers. So, the fact is we don't have the level of public funding that we need, and that's the case not just in Virginia. That's the case in every state. And there are lots of reasons for that. There are historical reasons for that. There's the fact that public education is a right in the Virginia Constitution and all 49 other constitutions. It is, childcare isn't. But one way or another, that lack of permanent, dedicated public funding is sort of the start and end of the conversation about how do we fix this. There's this question of how do you fund subsidy at the true cost of quality, and what all that means is right now, what subsidy does exist is not actually being given to programs at enough of a level for them to pay their teachers well. Again, it's artificially depressed. It has to do with the lack of money in the system, but there are more and more states are starting to shift the way that they pay their providers via subsidy. And that's something that a lot of states are looking at. Wage scales for staff or otherwise putting in wage floors for staff is something that's being explored by some states and some localities. So again, the analogy here is public education, right? The idea, and in some of the federal legislation, no child care educator should be making less than a living wage. You really should be walking them up towards pay parity with their elementary school counterparts. So that's, another piece of it. Something that's exciting in Virginia, there's something called the Virginia Promise Partnership, which may come up with the later speakers. And basically it's a coalition, it's a wide ranging coalition of advocates, business leaders, and other public education stakeholders, all sorts of stakeholders. And there's this basically North Star goal that by 2030, we want childcare to be affordable and accessible for all Virginia families. And that's actually really a new way of approaching childcare advocacy. In the past, it was very piecemeal. It was very much incremental, like let's just get what we can get, year by year. Now that there's such a spotlight that's been shown on early childhood education, like there's this idea of, okay, we need a big goal. We need to know how much it's going to cost, and we need to know how we're going to pay for it, because it pays for itself, but we do need that down payment. There's a piece that is important around strong local infrastructure and innovation. The sign that Smart Beginnings has been really great about, and many of the partners here as well, is thinking about how do we actually deliver childcare in a way that parents can access easily. Right now, the contrast is, someone once said to me that kindergarten finds you. If there are enrollment fairs and there's food and there are balloons, and pre-pandemic at least, right? And if you don't send your kid to kindergarten, someone's gonna knock on your door. early care and education is very different. It can often, I kind of joke, it's more like if kindergarten finds you, early childhood education is in like some deep dark forest somewhere that you have to go through some thickets to find, in a slot that's affordable. And so this idea of how do you build that infrastructure, that governance, that system that it makes it easy to find the care that you want or need for your kid is really important. And right now we have fairly antiquated systems that need to be updated. And then lastly, I'll say something that I constantly talk about. There are economic benefits and there are human benefits to this. Having an effective early childhood education system is foundational to human flourishing, to the future of the Commonwealth, and that's something we need to talk about, not merely as economics, though it is an economic case, but also the idea that you should have to have this huge stress while you're a young family, while you're adjusting to having a child, instead of being able to focus on being a family, like on a very human level. That seems wrong, to have your choices about how your work and care arrangement are going to look dictated by the availability and affordability of a childcare slot versus, again, what works best for you and your family. That seems wrong. So I think we can make multiple cases about why early childhood education is so very important, and why investing in it is an imperative. And I'll say this last sort of note, the exact solution actually matters less than having a real solution. We can't piecemeal this. We can't do incrementalism anymore. The system is buckling and is on the verge of collapse, quite honestly. And so, right now is the time for us to step up as a locality, as a region, as a state, and as a country to really put our money where our mouth is around the importance of children and families. And then if you go to the last slide here, because I'm going to wrap up, there are examples very recently of states and localities doing some pretty exciting things. So a few headlines. So New Mexico, they've expanded their subsidy eligibility to reach more families. They've also started to pay at the cost of care I mentioned. Illinois, if you're at or below the poverty line, you pay now $1 a month. It's essentially you have free child care. That's a permanent change they made. DC, just north of us, made a pretty huge move of funding pay parity for their infant and toddler educators with their pre-K and elementary school educators, and that literally included sending $10,000 checks to their childcare workers, and they're going to permanently increase the compensation there, using tax revenues from a tax on high earners. And so and then that map there is all sorts of local ballot measures that we've seen, across the nation in the recent years past. So the fact is, like, we know voters care about this, businesses care about this, everyone cares about this. And so now it's all about, how do we come up with a plan, and how do we front and center make sure that we are getting more money into the system, so that every child, every family, every early childhood educator has what they need to thrive. And I'm going to pause there for some questions, and I'm excited to be here again, and thank you for the opportunity.
Any questions?
No questions in Q&A, but just so everybody knows, we will be posting the slides on RVA Engage website in a day or so.
So Elliot, you're not quite off the hook, because I have a few questions for you then. Can you take a minute and explain why quality, because we talk a lot about high quality early care and education. Why is that quality word so important, and how does that actually come into being?
Yeah, that is a great question. Thank you. So quality, what we know, all that evidence about how early childhood education helps children is all predicated on it being high quality. And what we mean by quality is a couple of things. Like, at a very core level, it means there's a warm and attentive relationship between a caregiver and a child, right? Children are experiential creatures, especially young children. And that's how the brain learns, is in relationship. And so what that means is we need to have caregivers who are well compensated, because we want them to be stable, we want them to be present, we want them, young children thrive on reliability and consistency. So we also don't want huge turnover of the early childhood workforce. We also know that it means that there can be other things in place, that teacher has the training that he or she needs to be able to, look, like I have 2 young children, but I also don't go to work every day with a classroom of 7, 2-year-olds. Like that's its own set of, it's very skillful, it's very demanding work. And so we also know that quality means making sure that, that teacher has what they need to be able to succeed. So there's lots of great work, and I'm sure some of the other speakers could talk to it as well, to improve quality and try to assess quality within Virginia programs. But it really is, you're right, the everything about the impact is predicated on being high quality.
There's also a lot of conversation going on about the importance of family voice and family choice, especially when it comes to families who maybe don't have the same choices and access that middle income families have. Can you talk about both family voice and family choice and its importance in early childhood systems?
Absolutely. So fundamentally, we need a system that is responsive to parent needs and preferences, right? And what we know from survey after survey after survey is that parents want a wide variety of different things, and those preferences are dynamic. What you may want, what you consider the best situation for your child when they're an infant, may be different than when they're 3 years old, maybe different than within a few months, depending on what happens in your family circumstances. And so what we know in terms of centering voice and choice is that we want to have a vibrant pluralistic system. And we do. We have what's called mixed delivery, which is just a way of saying that deliver childcare or early childhood education both through public settings. So, right, our Richmond Public Schools has pre-K centers, and through private settings. So we can be delivered just as well by faith-based childcare, by a family childcare provider where there's somebody who just takes some children into their home. And the parent voice too means that we want to make sure that care is responsive to parents' want and need. We don't want to do to, we want to do with, right? And so if you basically say, oh, we think parents are gonna definitely, all parents want to send their kid to a pre-K that looks like a public school, and that's all you do is you put all the pre-Ks in public school. What we found in other places is that actually doesn't really meet the needs, or if it's not the right hours, right? A lot of parents, particularly parents on the lower end of the income spectrum, work non-traditional hours. They work nights, they work weekends, and so there needs to be care available during that time. So that's what we mean by that. I saw in the Q&A, can I grab a question from the Q&A? There's a question
I was going to ask you, there's one question in the Q&A regarding the Quebec program that you mentioned, and there have been other things that have come out about a program in Tennessee and whether there are good or bad outcomes there. Can you talk about programs and bad outcomes and what that really means?
Yes, absolutely. So these are two extremely different contexts. So I'm going to take them kind of in chunks. So the Quebec story is basically they expanded too fast. So when they started their program in 1997, they said, we want to have a slot available for every single child in Quebec by the year 2000. And as you can imagine, if you start with a poorly funded system in 1997 and say we have 3 years, 2.5 years to scale this thing up from a workforce standpoint, from a facility standpoint, from a quality standpoint, that is not a great idea. And so they went too fast, and you talk to the Canadian childcare advocates and they'll admit that, and they'll say, now the program, especially the program in the more publicly run centers, is quite high quality. Quality is the problem is there's a lot of variability. So you did end up there where sort of the private providers ended up pretty low quality. That has not been replicated as much in the US, where we have more of a vibrant mixed delivery system. But the Quebec story is not affordable childcare doesn't work. It's you have to, as one advocate or researcher said to me, you have to go slow and go thoroughly. And so that's, I think a lot of the thoughtfulness behind, the programs in Virginia, right? The Promise Partnership saying we want to do this by 2030, right? That's 8 years from now. That's enough time to take it in phases. And Tennessee is an interesting one because, it seems to be a story again around quality, and a story in some cases potentially of actually there being too much academics in pre-K. So they were looking at a cohort at the end of the 2000s, which is, without getting too into the weeds, is basically you're talking about the end of the kind of No Child Left Behind era, right? There's sort of a push down of academics to decay and then down to pre-K, and there's actually been a lot of transformation of the Tennessee program even since those cohorts were studied in the mid 2010s. What's interesting, I think sometimes we overgeneralize from one study, and it's a good quality study, but there's also a study with the exact same methodology, this randomized control trial out of Boston that came out last year that found exactly the opposite. They found that the kids who, the lottery winners of the Boston pre-K program, by the time they were, in high school and college, were doing significantly better than those who were the lottery sort of losers. And so, all that to say, it's complicated. All sort of early childhood research is complicated. Kids are complicated. But what we do know is that high quality programs, they're play-based. That's another part of quality, which you asked about earlier. Do tend on average to do, kids tend to do quite well in them. And so obviously get in more of that later, and anyone wants to follow up with me and email them, I can get some resources for them around that.
So I think I know there are more questions starting to pop up, but we promised Elliot, who has 2 very young children himself, that we would let him go in time for story time. So we will send the additional questions to Elliot and ask him if he would be willing to address those, and we will produce those answers for everyone. So I hope you all will join me in thanking Elliot for his time. We are very fortunate to have had him for the evening as one of our keynote speakers. So thank you, Elliot, so much.
Thank you. Thank y'all.
Have a good night. Okay, so now we're ready for our second set of polling questions for the night. There are 2 questions here. One is just a simple question. Do you know how many children 5 and under who live in our region? And then the second question, a little more provocative. Do you know what percentage of those children actually live in poverty? And we're just talking about children in our broad region. Right now, that region is considered, according to the Department of Education, to span from Hanover County at its northity north, all the way down to Greensville County on the North Carolina line. So pretty big footprint of 17 localities that make up our region. So how many children and what percentage of them are in poverty? I'll give everybody just another second. Go ahead, make an educated guess. Don't be afraid of the polls. Nobody knows who you are or what your answers are. Okay, Christina, you want to share what you've got for us? Really good guesses and maybe some educated guesses in there as well. It is true there are 75,000 children under the age of 5 in our region. For those of you who are more familiar with the Richmond footprint, that is 65,000 children and then 10,000 children in the southeast portion of our footprint. And the percentage of children living in poverty is actually 40%, although that average is a slightly dangerous thing. 35% of the children in the region on average are in poverty. The average is dangerous because in each locality, the actual percentage ranges anywhere from 15% to 70%. So each locality very different. So hopefully lots more there that you'll hear some about as we keep moving forward. So I want to introduce our next speaker for the evening. We're again delighted to have him with us, and don't forget, put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll have a few minutes with him at the end. I want to introduce Dr. Kartik Athreya. He's the Executive Vice President and Director of Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. His work has been published in a variety of academic journals, including the Journal of Monetary Economics, the American Economic Journal, Macroeconomics, and International Economic Review. He is also the Associate Editor of the Journal of Economic Dynamics and Control. In recent years, he's taught a doctoral class in macroeconomics at the University of Virginia and has authored a book entitled Big Ideas in Macroeconomics. He earned his doctorate from the University of Iowa in 2000 and his research interests are in macroeconomics and consumer finance. His current research aims to measure and understand household financial distress and debt repayment decisions to quantify the links between household investments in human capital, just what we're talking about tonight, and in the stock market, and to assess the importance of risk associated with college enrollment and for educational attainment and inequality. I'm not sure I did all of that incredible introduction worthy, but Kartik, if you would take it away for us now, and we'll see if we can get your presentation up and running.
Katherine, thank you so much. And I deeply regret not abbreviating that bio. I am so sorry that you had to go through that. I'm so sorry for the entire audience to have to listen to it. I'm happy to be here, and thanks for letting me be a part of this. And I'll maybe wait a second to see if my slides pop up. Will that happen automatically? I think it will.
It should. Give me, I think I'm trying to help a little bit in the background with some things that are going on. So give me just 1 second to see if I can make that happen for you.
Perfect. Yes. Excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, and it's really nice to follow Elliot, with whom I engage in other places, and in where we both work, and to talk about the issues that we're here today to do. I'm going to take a perspective that's a little bit more focused on parents, and in particular on the maternal labor force. I think it should dovetail well with the kinds of things that Elliot already talked about. So these are my views, and do not necessarily represent those of the Richmond Fed or the Federal Reserve System. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's go to the next slide. Great. What I want to argue to you today is that COVID was an event, and it could have been something else besides COVID, but COVID is the thing that happened to us. It really reduced, in my view, the efficiency with which we delivered childcare and child enrichment. So I use the word childcare here, but I think you should think of it much more broadly. The reason is that, in general, caring for children or enriching their lives is labor intensive. It takes time. It's the kind of thing that is very costly for many of us to outsource. So a couple of things happened. First of all, for perfectly sensible reasons, during the beginning of the pandemic, we decided that we couldn't have schools operate as before, just like we decided workplaces couldn't operate as before. But that very sensible public health sort of decision had tremendous consequences that many people in this room may be just directly aware of or indirectly aware of. And in particular, many who left the labor force ultimately were pushed back into one-on-one caregiving. And that's actually very costly to sort of insource. In the end, you're pulling a child back into the house, not able to take advantage of the economies of scale for creating a more efficient infrastructure, for sharing the costs of all the things that children need in common. All that stuff went away, and people had to take care of this one-on-one. Now, one of the things that happened during this period was that one-on-one caregiving ended up falling, from everything that we can tell so far, on mothers more than it did on fathers. This is probably not going to surprise a lot of people, but in some sense, I think it was a very stark reminder of how norms and trade-offs visited themselves much more heavily on moms than they did on other people. And I think that's part of the theme that I want to talk about today. So in the end, about 10 million children with 10 million moms rather with school-age children were not actively working. So let's go to the next slide. So for me, as a person who works at the Federal Reserve, I do want to think about all problems that are really large in the U.S. economy. And I want to submit to you that childcare policy is one of those things that I think really falls into the category of macroeconomic policy. This was implicit in the remarks that Elliot made, and I'll try to just put some details around it to help perhaps convince you even more. One of the first things that economists really have known for a long time is lots of stuff that gets produced in the economy doesn't get bought and sold in the marketplace. And when it doesn't get bought and sold in the marketplace, it doesn't get picked up in numbers that we usually measure. That doesn't mean it's not happening, obviously. And the use of specific data that economists have looked into in terms of how people actually use their time. These are surveys that measure how people use their time, really gets at the idea that home production, which is how economists think about what's going on outside the marketplace, home production is big. It might even be as large as half the size of GDP. You don't have to hang your hat on any one number, but the bottom line is that it's big. It would be big even if that number were 25%. Now, that also means that policy that affects paid work influences home work decisions. There are a variety of policies that change the trade-offs that families face and that especially mothers of young children face with respect to working in the marketplace or staying at home. These include things like the earned income tax credit, progressive taxation more generally, and other kinds of features all have bearing on decisions that households make and that moms make to work. In fact, what turns out to be true in the data is that some of the most sensitive groups to tax and transfer policies are actually mothers of children, much less so, for example, men in their prime age, somewhere between 25 and 54, who work much more robotically over the course of their lives than do others who are more sensitive. So it's an important thing to pay attention to from a policy perspective. Now, policy affecting home work decisions, of course, also influences paid work decisions and childcare in particular. This is also true for what it does to K through 12. So next slide, please. So now let's go back to COVID. One of the things that we saw is that in sectors that were really hit hard, women especially worked in essential sectors and sectors reliant on in-person interaction. So think about the food and accommodation industry, think about travel and hospitality. These are places that really had a tough time, especially especially the latter two. And you can see the big drop in women's labor force participation between right at the onset of the pandemic. It was an astonishingly sharp drop. And then you can see that it took a very long time, that's running off the screen a little bit, but it took a very long time for the numbers to kind of return to something like normal. Let me say two things. Hasn't returned fully to normal just yet, but it's also the case that it took a long time for women's labor force participation, the blue line, to catch up to the green line. And even this actually hides something, which is that if you look deeper into this, you'll see that the groups that have, let's say, lower levels of formal education are still participating at lower rates than they were pre-pandemic, and they bear the scars of the pandemic even now. So next slide, please. Now, I think, you can do a million different calculations. I just did some simple ones, and, you can talk about the wages lost for women by this kind of absence from the labor force. These numbers are not small. And I think, what I want you to take away is that, we took a bunch of people out. Yes, they started producing other services, namely the home production in the care and enrichment of their children. But to the extent that that was done in a way that they didn't have set up before because they didn't find it ideal for them, clearly represents a disruption and a loss in their lives. So next slide. And actually, I did have this slide. I'm sorry. So this gives you a bit more color in terms of showing how. Look at the dashed blue line at the bottom, where you have women with less than a BA degree. Well, that group, relative to the pre-pandemic period, is still close to 1.5% to 2% below in their labor force participation, even as other groups may have caught up substantially more. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, let's look ahead a little bit. Let's go to the next slide. So, the theme of my remarks really has been we should take the childcare in infrastructure and environment, landscape, ecosystem, however you want to describe it. We have to take it seriously because it's something that's connected to interruptions in women's labor force and connection to the labor market. And I think that's becoming only more consequential as time goes by. And a couple of simple summary statistics to indicate that this actually might be for more of the marbles than before is that you definitely see a larger share of the population now with a bachelor's degree. We're getting more educated. People are investing heavily in human capital. The share of the young population, 18 to 24, enrolled in college is now, much more lopsided in terms of women versus men. And so to the extent, and this is a conjecture, and I think I'd be happy to have thoughts from the crowd here and weigh in on this, to the extent that either norms or practices or other features of our lives make women the first line responders in terms of who flexes when things go wrong in the world, in their children's world especially, this is something that's going to cost us as a society more and more if we don't have a very robust and resilient kind of childhood educational and care and enrichment environment. Next slide, please. So this is in a way summarizing what I said. And I think, you know, a book that I would recommend to you, and I should have actually put the title here. The book is called Career and Family, Career and Family by Claudia Golden, who is a distinguished, one of the most distinguished labor economists in the United States, who's really been, you know, at the forefront of talking about how COVID has really changed the game. You know, much of the economic hit for college graduate women has been due to closing down of the caregiving sector. Now that pertains to the slide that I just showed you, because you might say, well, college educated women don't necessarily interrupt their labor force that much. They invested in an education, they intend to stay put. Well, yes, that's all well and good, except if you don't have a place for high quality enrichment for your child during the day, it makes it very hard to actually continue with that. So, you know, I would argue conjecturally, but I'm willing, I think, to stick my neck out a little bit to say, look, there's a couple of things at play. If norms don't change, a big chunk of the labor force really is subject to a shock that others are not. Women are also doing a majority of the skill acquisition right now in the economy, per the slides that I just showed you. And I think that, you know, it serves us well to pay attention to how we as a society can make sure that those investments end up yielding the most they can for the whole society. And even if norms do change, I think interruptions, as we all know, are going to cost us both in the short and the long run. This is actually a little more related to what Elliot said in the beginning. Some of the things that have happened that we've already documented in terms of the disruptions to the schooling environment, we're not seeing yet, I think, the true cost of what COVID has done. Now, I'm not suggesting that we could have avoided the closure of schools or the interruption to learning, but if we take from this the lesson that interruptions to learning are very consequential because learning begets learning, and I think that's a really important point that was implicit in everything that Elliot said, then we're going to pay for this interruption increasingly 5, 10, 15 years from now. We're going to see it then. And I think it's going to take a while for this to go through the pipe for us to realize just how damaging and inequitable COVID really has been for American society. One feature of that is going to be the cohorts that are going to bear the scars of having their educational programs interrupted, who will always be at a deficit simply because they fell behind once for a 2-year window. So this is, and I hate to be depressing on a Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock, but I think it's just important to gauge that we haven't yet seen the full brunt of what this interruption in the early childhood environment is actually going to cost us. I don't know how big it will be, but I suspect it will be significant. Last point is that COVID won't be the last shock. So I've talked a lot about COVID here, but I think it's emblematic of things that cause serious disruptions in the ability of the economy to function, whether that's a recession or something else. We need to make our future cohorts a little bit less susceptible to the vagaries of business cycles or the vagaries of shocks that happen in the world. Because in the current circumstance, I think that is actually true. A group is really resilient and protected against a lot of shocks, whereas other groups, children, are really not protected very well against shocks, the scars of which they will likely bear for the intermediate and distant future. Next slide, please. Now, one other thing I want to really draw your attention to is that these interruptions that happen, in maternal work life are actually important, because I think the fact that they're happening right now gives us a little bit of a chance to maybe create a way to have a boom loop instead of a doom loop. And this is something that I've been thinking about. And one of the things that certainly has been on the minds of economists in the past is that when employers consider an employee for a job and consider them for investment when they are working, investing in their careers, they have to think hard about the attachment of that worker to the labor force. And most companies don't have the luxury of necessarily just saying, well, I'll just take your word for it. I know that you'll stick around. So what ends up happening is that it's possible that employers generally say, well, some groups are more likely to leave the labor force in extremis or for other reasons, and therefore we'll be careful about how much we're actually fast tracking them in their careers. But to the extent that that's happening, it's also the case that the other side of the market thinks carefully about this and says, well, wait a minute, I'm not necessarily going to be given the fast track opportunities. I'm not necessarily going to be given all of the chances to be flexible so that I stay with a company or with an occupation for a career. So I too may not make the same investments that I would. I will not necessarily give everything and then some just in the off chance that my employer will retain me if something should go wrong. So you now have both sides kind of not necessarily seeing gains from kind of prolonged relationships and career building and fast tracking. And I think that's an important dynamic that if it's working, will actually hurt all of us. It will hurt the women who are making investments. It will hurt all of the people that never made the investments to begin with. It will hurt the children that work in those, that live in the households and so on. So if you want to flip this around now and end in a more positive way, I think we should think about how an early childhood environment could potentially really enable broad society to then feel, okay, everybody can now commit to particular career trajectories that will be useful for them and for the employers on the other side who will say, okay, look, now it makes sense for me to invest heavily because I do expect this person to stick with it. I do expect this person not to be pulled away by the vagaries of what might be happening in the economy or what might be happening due to a pandemic and things like that. And I think that's something that is, it's more conjectural again, but it's something that I think is really important in the longer run as a benefit of having a really robust childhood care and enrichment environment. So adequately scaled childcare, in my view, I think can actually really help unleash something that you might call this expectations boom loop. So that's just my view as an economist, but I'd be happy for pushback or thoughts related to that. Next slide. I think we may be close to the end. These are just some numbers. Elliot covered a lot of this. There's a sense in which, by and large, the studies, there are studies that find different things, but by and large, investment in early childhood really does look like an excellent investment overall in terms of rates of return. For scale, if you think about the stock market in real terms has yielded about 6% on average over the course of the last century or so. These numbers are all, tend to be north of that or right around it. So, for a society, this may be really money really well spent. And in fact, it should actually lead policymakers ultimately, hopefully, to be persuaded that this is not necessarily simply to be viewed as a redistribution, but it's rather to be viewed as a missing opportunity, as a missed opportunity to make everybody better off. There is, I think, a very clear argument that actually is maybe the relevant case. Next slide, please. That's it. So I'm happy for any comments or questions or criticism. And thank you very much for having me a part of this.
Kartik, just a quick question for you on that last slide, and then we'll check to see if there's anything in the Q&A. Otherwise, I also have lots of questions for you. That last slide talks about the return on investment. And often when people think about that return, the studies that the Federal Reserve and others have done talk about cost avoidance, teenage pregnancies, juvenile incarceration, the issues that seem to follow people in poverty in general that generate higher costs. Can you put your take on why is that return investment something that we can actually measure in terms of both societal impacts, but then also the economic impact that gets quantified from that?
So I think, yeah, it's very important to think about the kinds of benefits that you mentioned. For me, Katherine, I tend to categorize almost all of those things as sort of adjuncts to what a sensible person will do when they have a lot of potential to offer the labor market. And there's a sense in which one of the things, let me zoom out for a second. So one of the really incredible regularities in the world is when labor market prospects improve for human beings, men or women, one of the first things that happens is that they start having fewer children. This is sort of an iron law of demographics around the world. And one of the reasons that at least economists like me think that that's happening is that it starts becoming much more costly to kind of push you away from things that are really remunerative in other places. And so when we have human capital investments being made early in life that allow people to look ahead and think, my skills are really valuable, my time is really valuable. When time gets really valuable, a lot of other things that are time intensive give way to that. Early life childbearing, very early life childbearing is one of the first things that I think for many people think, no, this is not a good thing for me because it would now sidetrack me. So the better future that you can give somebody, the more they want to think about what that future is. And, a really famous economist named Dave Cass at one point said, parents have only one job, and that's to make their kids patient. And one way of framing that is by saying, well, when you have early childhood programs that are really comprehensive and enveloping, one of the things that they, I think, emphasize clearly is the idea that this is an investment bit by bit. These are things that will pay off. If you make these decisions now, there will be something for you later on. And I think it's entirely of a piece with kind of making people think about their futures in a much more deliberative way, and then making that future really, genuinely bright. So it's not surprising to me at all when studies find, oh, teen pregnancy goes down, incarceration rates go down. These are all the things that go down when people are more future oriented than they otherwise would be. And if they're not future oriented, I'm not saying it's their fault. It's that they have genuinely less to look forward to, and then you get all the decisions that go with having genuinely less to look forward to. That's sort of a blunt answer, but I hope that helped a little bit.
Yeah, well, and so one more question for you. You personally have done a lot of research around college attainment, and there's a lot of research out there that says there's a substantial income disparity between people of high school or lesser graduation and then college or higher attainment. But I'm curious, again, the Federal Reserve has done a lot of work around this notion of how do you finally bridge the gaps, and can you actually say, I want to put you on the spot, but I will. Can you actually say that strong investments in early education could change the college attainment equation in the United States, meaning there would be more children who could get to that level of success?
I'm so glad you asked that. You should have put me on the spot. The two things, just to get everybody level set. One of the really striking irregularities in the US is at public four-year colleges, the non-completion rate is very high. It's variously measured, maybe 40, 50%, depending on kind of which study you look at. One of the other things that's true about public four-year college in the United States, which is, by the way, the gorilla on the education landscape for higher education, that's where most of the kids go. It's very heavily subsidized. So we talk about the high cost of a four-year college education. Well, the key is it'd be much, much, much higher if the taxpayer weren't behind it the way they are right now. It is much, much cheaper than the cost of actually producing and delivering that service. Much, much cheaper. Now, if that's the case, then you really have to ask yourself the question, man, we're missing out on a lot. We're paying a lot for this service to be available, but we're feeding into it a lot of people that are not ready for that program. That's why you get the numbers that we get on the non-completion front. It's also why we get other groups earlier on just not even being ready to take it on. So we're not even getting everybody that could potentially do it, and doing things in high school that would end up setting themselves up for success in college. I'm not saying everybody should go to college, but what I am saying is, given the way that society has opted to support college through the public funding mechanism, I think there's no chance that we're getting the full bang for buck from that for the reasons that Katherine brought up. Early childhood, I think, is very critical to making sure that we get people on a track so that they do learn everything they learn, and then make the subsequent learning in 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade much easier. If the early stuff doesn't happen, then it's catch up all the way along. And then it's not at all surprising that people arrive at the end of high school or at the end of 10th grade far from ready to actually take on the next step. That's very consequential because for about 50, 60 years now, the technological change that's been happening in the United States has really favored people with more formal educational attainment than less. And so in a sense, what we're opting for when we don't take care of the front end of the learning continuum you end up getting much less out of the back end, and then you actually make people much more bifurcated, where one group is getting the big rewards for an investment they would already take. So a lot of you on this call will probably have kids that go to college. They were probably going to go even if college were more expensive, but a bunch of kids are not going and getting through, and the premium has been really high, almost a factor of 2 for a while. So that's a more unequal society that could get even more unequal unless we figure out kind of how to handle stuff at the beginning. And one question we could ask is, money doesn't grow on trees, is if you're ever going to think about trading things off, I think a public discussion on making sure that we're not compromising the early end because the way we think about what's going on in college, and that's the most politic way I can put it, I think there are gains to be had for us to have a serious conversation about that.
And last question for you, and I'm going to smash together a couple of questions that have come through the Q&A chat side of the world. So COVID clearly exposed for seniors. I'm one of those, so I can gently refer to everybody else in that group. People who are 50 and older who are thinking about what they can do, either coming back into the workforce or what they do because they've already done their business careers or their education careers or government careers. Is there a place in the economy for us to think about more senior workers, especially in early childhood, especially women in this older demographic, and couple that with the cost of childcare is so high, even as you described higher education, many of our viewers may not understand that the cost of early childcare is as high as the cost of a year of higher education. Like, do you think economically there's a place where we could just rearrange the whole equation here and do it in a different way? And, what would be your recommendation?
So that is a really hard question. And I'm going to disappoint you, I think, because I don't have a good answer for it. One of the things that I would point out is that, we're a society that is generally very, very rich compared to almost any society in the world. And one of the quote drawbacks of that is that our time is extremely valuable. So it's not surprising that almost every aspect of childcare turns out to be very expensive. What is expensive in the United States is anything that involves the time of other people. So a haircut in the United States is much, much more expensive in real terms than a haircut is in Guatemala or India, where my parents came from. And the reason is not because the job is different. The reason is because workers here are so productive that if you want to convince somebody to spend their time cutting your hair, you've got to pay them for it, because there's a lot of other things they could do. So one of the problems, one of the deep-rooted issues in a really, really productive economy like ours is that the value of everybody's time is extraordinarily high. And so time-intensive activities, so childcare is almost inherently a very time-intensive activity. It's not easy to put a bunch of robots into a room and then say, take care of our kids. I mean, most of us are not comfortable with that model of childcare, I think, as of yet. And if it's going to take human beings to do it, then it's going to be expensive, which is why in the beginning of my remarks, I was really emphasizing the fact that when we moved from the, more organized formal market or publicly provided childcare centers, which economize on the fixed costs of providing those kinds of services, where you have caregivers and instructors sharing the responsibilities for a large number of children, that's fundamentally, in my mind, more efficient than a one-on-one caregiving, or one-on-one enrichment environment that a single parent might have to provide for their children if that early childhood environment is not available. So that, I think, to me, is an opportunity for cost reduction. But I think we face a more general problem that a time-intensive activity in a rich economy is going to be an expensive proposition.
Well, we certainly didn't want to give you any easy questions, given that amazing bio that you have. We are all genuinely appreciative of your time. We're lucky in this region to have the Federal Reserve Bank be one of the assets that we have, and your focus on early childhood is deeply appreciated by probably everyone on this call by now. So thank you, and we hope you have a great night. And we're going to send you some questions as well to answer for some of our participants, if you would be willing to do that.
Oh, happily. Yeah. Thank you for very much for having me. And, these are always somewhat humbling and reminding me just how little I understand the world, but I do appreciate the chance to talk with you.
Thank you very much. Have a good night. Okay, so we're gonna keep going. We're gonna give you one more quick poll question. And this may be a test of what you've seen from tonight's discussion. So first question, how much of a child's brain is actually developed by the age of 5? So we've given you 3 choices there. And then as soon as you finish that question, answer the question about what percentage of children in our region don't arrive at kindergarten ready. And there's a standardized assessment that's used across Virginia to assess that. But what percentage of children don't arrive at kindergarten from our region ready to learn? So quick answers, and then we're going to move along to a great panel for you to close out. All right, so Christina, if we could see, so yeah, you guys have been amazing participants. 90% of a child's brain by the age of 5 is developed. Interestingly enough, by the age of 3, it's 80% of a child's brain is developed. And unfortunately, too many of you got the answer to the second question right. Over 40% of children in our region don't arrive. And again, that's very skewed across locality. Here's the staggering number that may be a little more frightening, because there's very recent data that's just been released this week, which is on the other side of COVID. In our region, the number of children not ready for kindergarten may now be, on average, as high as 55%. So if you didn't think the discussion this evening was important, you know, these 2 questions are really hoping to bring that home. So, so let us move on to the next section of the presentation. And I do promise we're going to finish right at 8 o'clock, as we promised everyone. We have panelists tonight who are going to share, unlike the economic, financial, sort of data-driven importance of early childhood, our next panelists actually understand the importance of advocacy for this issue and the social impacts that occur when we have disparities in early childhood system, or just quite frankly fail to have a successful early childhood system at all. So there are 3 people I'm delighted to introduce to you. The first is Mary Jo, we call her MJ, Grieve. She's the Director of Early Childhood Education for VPM. She joined them in 2015. Prior to that, she has over 40 years of early education experience. She's been a classroom teacher, a program director, an administrator, a school owner, an advocate, and of course, a public policy specialist. Before she joined VPM, she was the policy field organizer with the Delaware Valley Association for the Education of Young Children, and worked on their PK program for Pennsylvania. She's the co-owner of Leaf Spring, which is an early childhood provider in Mechanicsville. And she's just passionate about early childhood. Her quote, which I loved, was, she's made this her life's mission to work on equity in early childhood. She's from Pennsylvania originally, but she calls Richmond home now. And she's a wife, mother, and you won't believe it when you see her, she's also a grandmother. Emily Griffey is our second panelist. She is the Chief Policy Officer for Voices for Virginia's Children. She's the key contact for their government relations and policy analysis, everything that affects the health and well-being of children in Virginia. Emily is our advocate for that. She's quite an expert in early childhood herself and has a whole background in having worked in these issues prior to just doing the advocacy work that she's currently doing. She's advocated for expansion of preschool, equitable access to preschool, safe and affordable childcare, family economic supports. She's involved with the governor's children's cabinet. And here's maybe the most interesting thing that Emily does, is she makes sure that all of our soon to be elected, potentially elected, or currently elected officials actually have to understand or make a position as their candidates or running for candidates on ensuring that children are a priority when they take office. Prior to Voices, she's worked on issues for Richmond City Social Services and Baltimore Safe Harbor and Sound Campaign. She's a graduate of the Jepson School of Leadership at the University of Richmond and has her master's degree in public policy from Johns Hopkins. And then last but not least, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Tamika Daniel. Tamika is a behavioral health community organizer for Greater Richmond SCAN, which is Stop Child Abuse Now. Tamika is an East End community resident and mother of 4. She began advocating for the importance of early childhood when her young son was actually diagnosed with autism, and spent the next 10 years actually expanding her voice in advocacy. She now works for SCAN as the behavioral health community organizer. She uses her expertise to actually have an impact on adverse childhood experiences, also referred to as ACEs, trauma and resilience in communities. And she does a lot of work with families and brings a trauma-informed and equity lens to all the work that she does. So if you could join me in welcoming them, we're going to ask them a couple of hard questions for tonight. So it's their turn to be on the hot spot. Thank you, ladies, and welcome. We're delighted to have you here. So my first question, and we're going to ask each panelist the same question. We're a little late on time, so I'll ask you to be brief if you can, so we can cover as many topics as possible. But here's the first question. Tell a quick story about why you think early childhood investments are so important. And Tamika, I'd love to toss that question to you first.
I'm going to speak from personal experience, and it just shows in my son, my youngest son. He's 7 now, but he was born prematurely. I was 26 weeks, between 26 and 28 weeks. And through early intervention services, he was able to start school when he was 2, probably right before his 3rd birthday. Had he not been exposed to that, he would have had to wait because his birthday is in December. But him being in school since he was 2 has put him ahead of the game. So even though he was born prematurely and had some setbacks, when he entered into regular school and kindergarten, he's now in the 1st grade, even though they recognize that he's a slow learner, that's just the way he learns. He's ahead of the game right now. He's one of the smartest in his class, and his teachers let me know that every single time. So I actually see it for myself, the benefits of early childhood.
Thank you. MJ, what's your quick story on why it's so important?
So for me, I think that the human potential factor is number one. There is no better time in a person's life to impact their learning than these early years. So it's critically important that we invest in the future. For me, I was a young single mom, 22, and had a son, and he was really colicky. And for those that don't know what that means, he just never stopped crying. And I was, someone that had the privilege of help and guidance and education behind me. And I still struggled with those first few months. So I wanted to make sure in my lifetime that we helped parents, all parents, understand the importance of early care and education. And I've made it my life's mission.
Emily, to you.
Sure. I think for me, early childhood is where equity begins. And I think it's where we see the opportunity for equitable opportunities for school. So many families will pay a lot of money to ensure that their kids can get a high quality preschool experience and early childhood experiences. And that's just not affordable or attainable for many families. So for me, it's about investing in making sure that we have equitable opportunities right from birth.
Excellent, thank you. Next question, and MJ, I'll start with you this time. Racial equity is on everybody's mind these days. Maybe it always should have been. What is the one thing in early childhood that you think we need to do to better serve children and families in Black and Brown communities?
So I think what we need to do is really embrace humanities and culture. Black and Brown families and children need to see themselves reflected in their early care experiences. Our children need to know who they are, and we can't do that unless they see themselves reflected back. So everyday learning experiences, children need to see themselves, and we need to share that experiences with them.
Emily, what's your thought? Helping Black and Brown families more in the genre of early childhood?
Well, one thing is that we know low-income families and families of color are more likely to participate in our child care subsidy system, our financial assistance for childcare. So one thing that we can do is to make sure that more providers participate in the child care subsidy system. Right now, we don't have quite enough for as many children would like to be in that program. So for those who would like to participate, we want to see accessible and affordable options that are based on families' preferences. And if folks know providers who are not currently participating in the child care subsidy program, please pass the word along. Let folks know those reimbursement rates are higher, eligibility is higher for families, and we want to make sure that we are maximizing all of that financial assistance that is available right now.
Tamika, your organization, SCAN of Greater Richmond, obviously works very closely with children and families. What is your thought about what we can do better in this space to serve communities for Black and Brown families?
Piggybacking off of what Emily said, pooling more resources to the ones who are actually already participating in it. On the opposite scale of my son being exposed early, my daughter actually missed the whole year because when I ended up moving, by the time I got there was no transportation. And my premature son was only probably about 3 to 4 months out of the hospital. And they told me they would give me bus tickets, but then it would be no excuse for my daughter not to come. And I couldn't in good conscience catch the bus with my premature son in the cold months or when it was pouring down raining outside. So my daughter had to miss school for a whole year, and it actually put her behind a little bit. So for me, for those families, just paying attention to the needs and making sure that it's never an issue of transportation or the lack of spaces. Like you said, it is so many children who could have access that don't. And then sometimes when they do get access, they still can't get there. Some communities aren't safe for us to be walking or catching a bus and things of that nature. So, and then paying attention to each family's individual needs, because every Black and Brown family needs aren't the same.
Thank you. Okay, third question for each of you. And Emily, we're gonna start with you on this one. If you could convince the people on this call to get involved in early childhood, what would be the way that you would recommend they could do that?
I've got 2 things for folks. One is to repeat the things that you've heard tonight. So one of the things is to make sure that if you took nuggets of information, that you are going back and repeating that information to your colleagues, to your neighbors, and other things. What we heard tonight is that there's a fundamental problem with the funding of childcare in our communities, and families cannot afford to pay any more, and providers cannot afford to earn any less. We have to solve that problem by putting more money into our early childhood system. And we need to say these things that Kartik was saying about how we need more women to participate in the workforce, and our labor force and economy is going to be lopsided until we do that and invest in early childhood education. So take what you heard tonight and repeat it. And if you've lost your voice and you're not into talking, or it's easier to email, I'm going to put in here a link where you can take action with our state legislators who are considering the investments in early childhood right now. That link takes you to our action alert page at Voice's website. And right there, you can click through and find your legislators in Virginia and tell them that you want them to invest in early childhood education. They just got summoned back to finish the budget in a couple weeks, and I need to hear from you that early education is a priority.
Tamika, put a different spin on it. What would be the way that you would say people could get involved in early childhood if you could convince them tonight to do so?
Using their platform, whatever their platform may be, using it to the best of their ability, maybe even researching some local organizations that actually help in promoting early childhood. And the biggest thing for me is getting this information out to the underserved communities. I lived in public housing for about 5 years, and you will never imagine how much we don't get certain information. Not even in the schools, we don't get certain information. So just making sure that information gets out to the communities that it needs to get out to.
MJ, you want to bring this particular question home for us?
Absolutely. I think anyone that's on this call that would like to apply for a job in an early childhood program, there are lots of jobs out there. Or if you want to volunteer, I think that would be a great place to start. At VPM, we are here to listen, to help be a voice for families, for educators. You can go to our website and check out our 5 core focal points of engagement and see what resonates with you, see what bubbles up and aligns with your passion, and then share those ideas. There's a form, I think that they'll put it in the chat, that you can fill out and tell us your story. We are here to listen and to hear what the early childhood community has to say. So please visit our website and take a look at that and tell us your stories.
Emily, give us the final word. Why is advocacy so critical in early childhood?
Yeah, well, as you heard today, there's a number of complex issues in this sector, from the funding to the workforce to how it gets delivered and who participates. And so what needs to happen with advocacy is that there's a constant drumbeat of what's needed and why it is needed. You've heard too that we haven't had the large scale change yet in early childhood and the big investments. It's been very incremental and slow. And that's been sort of true to Virginia's nature of having a divided government and the way that our policy process works. But it's time to take some big bites at this apple. We know we're not, that we're really far behind. And so what needs to happen is that for everybody here to contact their legislators, contact their city council members, their school board members, let them know that early childhood is a really important part of our puzzle and of our economy. You heard there's every reason to be doing this, from the economists saying it, that it's a good investment, from brain researchers telling us that this is the best time to invest. We just haven't had the opportunity to really move the needle and take a big bite. So this is our time and this is our moment. So thank you for everyone who spent the evening with us today. Now go ahead and share what you've learned with others too.
Tamika, give us the final word on the importance of family voice and lived experiences and how we shape early childhood going forward.
For me, it starts at home, and nobody knows what your child needs more than you do in the beginning. And being involved and having your voice heard, it actually contributes to the mental health, social, emotional health of your child, being able to partner with your child's teachers, because the school, the home, and the community, all three of those sectors integrate at some point, and they all affect what the child will end up doing. And I learned that from personal experience. When all of us were on different pages, my daughter was in complete and utter chaos. But once we all got on the same page, she started flourishing. And it's important for the child to see that as well, that their parent is involved. It makes the child happy. Hey, my mom is there. Hey, my dad is there. I'm important.
MJ, family education, actually education for all of us, about how to help elevate really young children to achieve their potential. What's your final word?
So my final word is from VPM side. One of our initiatives at VPM is to partner with other community organizations around the Basics Initiative. It's an initiative that came down from the Harvard Achievement Gap and Dr. Ron Ferguson. It's 5 simple behaviors that everyone can do with children every day. It talks about brain development in that first 3 years, and they are 5 principles that you can do every day to build your child's brain and to help with school readiness, maximize love, manage stress, talk, sing, and point, count, group, and compare, explore through movement and play, and read and discuss stories. This is the key to helping families get a great start in life and then succeed in school. Dr. Ferguson refers to it as a socio-ecological saturation, a community involvement of partnering together and really drilling down on those basic skills, those life skills that happen all the time, that everyday activities that we can do with our children to help them be successful. Dr. Ferguson refers to it as collective intentionality. And what he says is what none of us can do alone, all of us can do together. And this is you're seeing the socio-ecological saturation. It's all of the community coming together, learning about the basics and helping to spread that word.
Thank you all. You've been a tremendous panel. I know we pushed a little quickly here at the end, but we will make sure all of the slides are available. And you guys are amazing advocates across this community. We are fortunate to have VPM, Voices, and SCAN of Greater Richmond, and the 3 of you as allies in this important movement forward to change the system of early childhood and education. So thank you for tonight. A couple quick things. We have one final poll that we want to share with you. So this is your last chance, and this will tie into the discussion that we've been having, which is what can you do to actually have an impact? So 2 questions. Language, it's the most difficult thing for children to learn. It can be significantly accelerated if caregivers do something important, which is respond to a baby's voice. What percentage of response do you have to give in order to significantly change the curve for a child and their ability to learn? And the second question, and again, don't forget to scroll down to see all the answers, is why? Why do you think books and reading to children is so very important to the development of really young children? We think about it in school-age children, but really young children, the books are important as well. So answer these final 2 survey questions quickly, if you would. And while you're doing that, let me just wrap up with a few more things. We really appreciate all of your time this evening, the investment that you've made to be with us. A huge shout out again to RVA Engage for making this event come together, the community collaborators who took the time to really invest in this, the 3 women who did such great work as our event fit managers, and of course, all of you who participated. We hope you learned something about early childhood tonight and that you would be willing to get involved. And let's show the final results of the poll for the evening. The answer is, in fact, 80% of the time. And on average, most parents, caregivers respond to young children only 50 to 60% of the time. But that response actually keeps those little brains working and moving. So if you can't get involved any other way except when you're around a young child, respond actively to them every time they coo or speak to you. And then, of course, the last question of the evening is all of the above. Books just matter in every way. Maybe one of the most important things that we're learning is children need to see themselves in books in order to really see their own potential and their own future. So more books donated that allow young children to see themselves is an especially important part of what we're all trying to achieve. You've been terrific. Thank you so much for your time tonight, and we look forward to seeing you in the next 2 series. Good night to our panel. Thank you all.